Kangaroo Airways Flight 377. Chapter 4. Reality is a Nightmare. 22nd of May, 2018. Reality is a nightmare. For 3 days since she was rescued from the East China Sea after the crash, Georgina drifted into and out of sleep. When awake, she was haunted by the memories of what happened. Seeing people clawing at each other, fighting for freedom. Seeing dead bodies floating in the water. Remembering rummaging through her life jacket supply pouch with cold, wet hands, finding the flare and firing it up into the dark, stormy night sky above her, without holding out much hope that anybody would see it. Remembering her rescuer's first words to her as she'd sat shivering under a blue blanket in the back of the crash rescue boat. "What's your name?" "I'm Georgina. I'm Georgina Potter." "I'm Matthew. Damn, it's good to see you, Georgina." Georgina had started crying then. Although Georgina felt sure it had been against protocol, she remembered him wrapping his muscular arms around her and whispering softly in her ear, "Shh, it's okay. You're going to be okay. It's over." It had helped at the time, but it wasn't true, was it? It was far from over. For Georgina, the nightmare was just beginning. To his credit, Matthew hadn't just rescued her and then left her to it. He had visited her over the past few days as often as he was able to. Sometimes she would be asleep for the entire duration of his visit. Other times, she would wake up to find him holding her hand and she squeezes his hand back in return. It was the only times that Georgina had felt like smiling. At first, Georgina hadn't known where she was. All she knew was that she was in a hospital bed somewhere, but one hospital looked more or less like any other hospital to her. Crisp sheets, white walls, serious nurses. Eventually, she had asked Matthew where they were. He had seemed surprised that she hadn't asked sooner. "You're in a US military hospital, in Okinawa." When asleep, the memories are distorted. The drowned dead open their eyes, reach out towards Georgina through the seawater, grab her legs, and drag her under. She tries to scream, but it is not possible. Even if a scream could be heard underwater, there is only the drowned dead there who could have heard her, and they offer no sympathy. Those not holding her down instead claw her and bite her flesh. It only takes 2 to drag her down, and there were 52 passengers aboard Kangaroo Airways Flight 377. That's a lot of biters. Georgina's blood is swirling through the water, forming a thick, red mist. It is as if the whole sea is turning into blood. Through the blood, Georgina sees a face before her. Who is it? Another of the drowned dead? No, it is their queen. It's Chloe. She smiles at Georgina to reveal unnaturally long, sharp teeth. Georgina tries to break free, but the hands gripping her are too strong. Chloe opens her mouth wide and draws closer and closer. She is going to eat Georgina's face. She feels Chloe's teeth begin to dig into her flesh. And then Georgina wakes up, sweating and afraid, all alone in a hospital bed in Okinawa. She looks forward to Matthew visiting her again. She wishes he was here now to tell her the same comforting lie, to tell her that it's over. The only other patient nearby Georgina is suffering from serious burn injuries and keeps crying out in pain. Georgina doesn't know what comforting words will make the poor woman feel any better. She hopes that the nurses will have some way of easing the woman's pain. Georgina has her own demons to deal with. A small fuzzy television set hangs over Georgina's hospital bed. Georgina scrolls through the TV channels, wondering whether any news network has covered the Kangaroo Airways Flight 377 crash, and if so, how close to the truth their report gets. It takes Georgina longer than she would have liked to find any news channel covering the crash. Finally, she finds a news broadcast about the tragedy of Kangaroo Airways Flight 377. It is midway through when Georgina finds the news feature. The news report is in Japanese, which unfortunately means that Georgina cannot understand most of what is being said, but she does catch snippets here and there and gets the gist of the story. An angry man from China was blaming Taiwan for the incident. An equally angry woman from Taiwan was blaming China. The Japanese news reporter was doing her best to remain impartial. As far as Georgina could tell, there was no mention of any wrongdoing on the part of Kangaroo Airways. They had left them to die. There hadn't been enough life jackets. They had flown through dangerous airspace. Surely, there must be some mistake. Perhaps they had covered Kangaroo Airways' involvement earlier in the story, or maybe they had mentioned it and Georgina simply hadn't understood. She carried on scrolling through the channels, desperate to find an English-language channel covering the story. Thankfully, as she was in a US military hospital, the satellite TV was capable of picking up many US TV channels. Scrolling through the shopping network, baseball, and the Itchy and Scratchy show, Georgina became increasingly impatient. Finally, she found Fox News, where the crash was briefly mentioned in between a story about Kim Kardashian's latest boob job and a story about the latest act of monumental idiocy by President Donald Trump. Tragedy struck over the East China Sea last Wednesday as Kangaroo Airways Flight 377 fell into the ocean. At this stage, it still isn't clear exactly what the cause of this accident was, or even if it can really be called an accident. We are still receiving mixed reports, with Taiwan saying that a Chinese pilot illegally invading their airspace collided with the passenger plane, whilst the Chinese stance is that a Taiwanese pilot opened fire on both the Chinese jet fighter and the Australian passenger plane. With both China and Taiwan refusing requests from the Australian government to investigate the crash, it is doubtful whether we will ever know the full story. The news story then cuts to a Taiwanese spokesman. "Maybe Australia can ask the Pope to investigate for them," he quipped. It was a bad joke which Georgina found to be in very bad taste. Australia supported the One China policy, and China didn't allow official contact between the Australian and Taiwanese governments. However, they did both share a diplomatic link with the Vatican, meaning that the Pope was a mutual acquaintance. Desperate to end the news story on some semblance of a positive note, the broadcast continued. "Shocking stuff, Carol. Tell me, do we know yet if anybody survived the crash?" "Yes, Richard, shocking indeed. Reports indicate that against all odds, there were 4 survivors. 3 members of Kangaroo Airways flight crew, the pilot, John Fiddler, the co-pilot, Colin Begg, and a flight stewardess, Chloe Markham. And just 1 passenger, Georgina Potter, a British reporter." Just 1 passenger and a fellow reporter at that? Hard to tell if she's extremely lucky or unlucky. Either way, she's going to have some story to tell. Unlucky, definitely unlucky, thought Georgina. I do have a story to tell, though. I have to. I'm the only one who can get the truth out there, but can I make anyone listen? Georgina wasn't surprised to hear that Chloe, John, and Colin had survived. They had been picked up by the same US Navy crash rescue boat that had rescued her. Moments after, Georgina had sat in the back of the crash rescue boat with Matthew. They had seen another flare rise up into the night sky. Matthew had described flares as painting beautiful pictures of hope. Georgina had been surprised that a naval officer had such a poetic soul. Matthew was nothing like the military stereotype she'd had in her mind, and Georgina was grateful that this was the case. After being rescued, Chloe had sat down as far away from Georgina as she could get. Georgina had been disgusted to see that despite everything which Chloe had been put through, when she first stepped onto the crash rescue boat, Chloe had still looked more beautiful than Georgina ever would. She had lost her flight jacket, and the short, white shirt which she had worn beneath it had appeared to be semi-transparent and was clinging to her skin due to the rain and the waves. Chloe had looked more like a young glamour model competing in a wet t-shirt contest than a survivor from an air crash. From where she had been seated, Georgina hadn't been able to make out the exact words that Chloe had been saying to the Navy officers who fawned over her. The sound of the storm had been too great. Instead, Georgina had studied Chloe's face closely, examining her mannerisms as she spoke. Chloe had feigned sadness and remorse, but every so often Georgina would catch a hint of a smile on Chloe's face. It was so eerie. Georgina had heard the mannerism referred to before as duper's delight. It was caused by a rush of endorphins, which some liars feel when they believe they have successfully deceived someone. Was Chloe a sociopath? John held the payphone in his hand, counting each ring and wondering whether or not he really wanted the person he had phoned to answer his call. 6, 7, 8, 9. Perhaps he should hang up now. He could tell himself that he had tried, yet part of him knew that this wasn't really an option. He needed to speak to her, to hear someone tell him that he had done the right thing. 10, 11. Hello? A young woman's, or perhaps a girl's voice came on the line. John doesn't think it's the person he's called to speak to, but he had only met her the once, so just in case he asks if it's her. Hello? Is that Mrs. Big? John asked. He hears an irritated sigh from the other end of the phone. As if, the female voice replied exasperatedly. Ma'am? John then heard the voice yell. So it was a girl then, John thought. Colin's daughter. Phone for you. Coming! John just about made out someone yell in reply. Then the sound of feet running or stomping loudly downstairs. And finally, John heard Mrs. Begg's reply. Hello, Colin, is that you? She asked. Hello, no, not Colin, Mrs. Begg. It's John Fiddler. We met last year at Kangaroo Airways annual family picnic. Mrs. Begg couldn't conceal the disappointment when she replied. Oh, she said. A pause. Please, call me Jane. Okay, Jane, John tested. Is Colin okay? I saw on the news that he'd survived, but I haven't heard from him since the crash. This time, it was John's turn to pause. This was such an uncomfortable conversation. He's alive, John began, thinking it was best to start with the positive. But he was badly injured. Head trauma. He's not himself, Jane. Colin's barely been able to talk since then. He needs you, Jane. Another pause, this time uncomfortably long. Jane? John tried again. John can't be sure whether Jane is sighing or crying. No, John, I can't. I won't, she replies. John is surprised. This wasn't what he had wanted to hear. Mrs. Begg? Jane? He's your husband, he protests. Her reply is both angry and sad. Why don't you ask Chloe to go to his side instead? Oh, fuck, John thinks. She knew about the affair. John replied, feeling deflated. Yes, what, did you think I didn't know? That I didn't see the way he looked at her? How long had you known, John? How long had you kept it from me that he'd been sleeping with that slut, Chloe? What was she, 19, 20? Jane raged. I didn't know for sure, John protested. I only guessed recently. If I'd been sure, I would have told you. Was that true? Would I really have told her? John thought. Where did his loyalties really lie? John heard Jane breathing heavily through the phone. Perhaps she was laughing. He couldn't really blame her for not believing him. Finally, she spoke again. What are you calling me for, John? I've already told you. I'm not going to be the dutiful wife and cry by Colin's side. As far as I'm concerned, he was dead to me the moment he slept with Chloe. Was that all you wanted? John stammered his answer. No, that wasn't it. I wanted you, needed you to tell me that I did the right thing, to tell me that I made the right call in saving Colin, he finally managed. John already knew that his wish wasn't going to be granted. He heard Jane begin to laugh. There was no joy in that laugh, though. There was only sadness, tiredness, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I can't do that for you, John. I saw on the news that only one passenger survived, Jane replied. Could you have saved more if you'd left Colin behind? Did you even try to save more? John didn't reply. He couldn't. Finally, Jane continued speaking. Look, if you want forgiveness for all your sins, go find a priest. I've got nothing for you. And with that, she hung up. John had never felt more alone. What now? Chloe had been dreaming too. Not a nightmare, for to truly have a nightmare one must be able to feel fear, and as a sociopath, Chloe was unable to feel fear the way that normal people do, but to most people her dreams would still have seemed horrific. Even in Chloe's dreams, she was always the star. Most of her dreaming was lucid, with Chloe being able to exert some influence over the direction of the dream. In this particular dream, Chloe saw herself as one of the beautiful sirens from Greek mythology. She was completely naked. Her wet body seemed to shimmer in the moonlight as Chloe writhed on her back on the small rocky island in the middle of the ocean. Surrounding the island on every side were long rocky stones, which looked like spears or the teeth of some hungry sea monster. Chloe began to move more vigorously, and as well as gyrating her hips and arching her back, she began to wave her arms about as if she was dancing or conducting some ghostly orchestra, which only she could see. It was then that Chloe began to sing. Her voice was the loveliest that had ever been heard. As she sang, sailors steered their ships towards her and drew closer and closer until their ships were crushed on the rocks surrounding Chloe's island, dooming everybody aboard their vessels. Ship after ship sailed to their doom to hear Chloe's lovely voice and to catch a glimpse of Chloe's beautiful body. Chloe found that she could feel every death as it occurred, and the feelings were ones of pure pleasure. She began to touch herself. Chloe's singing voice became even louder. Now planes could be seen in the skies. The passengers and the pilots aboard could all hear her voice and were powerless against it. One after another, the planes nosedived and crashed into the sea surrounding Chloe's island. Chloe could feel that there were no survivors. Finally, one last plane appeared in the sky. Its arrival was inevitable. It was the grand finale, which could only mean one thing: Kangaroo Airways Flight 377. Aboard the plane were Harpreet, Gemma, Todd, Georgina, John, Colin, and all the other doomed passengers. Their only desires were to hear Chloe, to see her body, and to die for her. Kangaroo Airways Flight 377 flew down, faster and faster, until it too crashed into the ocean for Chloe. It was a fitting climax. It was then that Chloe woke up. The phone was ringing, but Chloe was in no rush to answer it. She had enjoyed the dream and wished it could have lasted a little longer. Whoever had disturbed her dream could go swivel. Instead of lying on hard rocks, as Chloe had in her dream, she lay on a luxuriously soft, queen-sized bed. Chloe was wearing a small, silky red nightie. She stretched and smiled. Since leaving the hospital, Chloe had been staying at the Red Lotus, a 5-star hotel which had been paid for by Kangaroo Airways upper management. Chloe had spoken to them regularly since the crash. They were nervous and wanted to ensure that Chloe was ready, that she knew exactly what lines she was supposed to say about the crash whenever anybody questioned her. If Chloe were to fight with upper management on this, if she were to strangely decide to tell everybody the truth rather than the convenient lies which made both her and Kangaroo Airways look better, then they were capable of ruining her. If she played along and said all the right things, then they would make her both rich and famous. Which did Chloe want? The carrot or the stick? The veiled threat had been unnecessary. Just mentioning the reward would have been enough to further motivate Chloe to toe the line. But Chloe knew that Kangaroo Airways CEO, Sean Spender, was a weak, emotional man desperate for the appearance of strength. Threatening those beneath him, whether the threat was truly necessary or not, was just how Sean operated. Please leave your message after the beep. Beep. The phone went to voicemail. Chloe heard John Fiddler's voice. She had avoided speaking with him since they'd both been rescued, and did not intend on speaking with him now either. Hi, Chloe? Sheila, I really need to speak to you. It's Colin. He's in a bad way. I'm not sure he's going to make it, and right now, with how bad he is, I'm not sure if it would really be best if he lived or died. He needs you, Chloe. He doesn't have anyone else, and you said you loved him. And a pause and a sigh. I need you too. At least, I need to speak to you, to hear you tell me that we did the right thing. Fuck, girl. Did we do the right thing? Did you? Only one passenger survived. Was that the best you could do? Did you really try? And with that, John hung up. Perhaps he'd ran out of space to record his message, or perhaps he just hadn't had enough strength to say anything more. Chloe didn't know, and she didn't really care. She was incapable of caring. John was so pathetic, and from the sound of it, Colin was now even worse. She had no wish to spend more time than was absolutely necessary with either of them again. Chloe remembered how hopeless John had looked even when they had been rescued from the life raft by the US Navy. The life raft was just a big flotation device, and in the middle of the storm at sea, they would never have managed to survive if they hadn't been picked up by the US Navy. It had been Chloe who had fired their flare shortly after having seen another flare in the distance. She would have preferred to be the first to be rescued, or better yet, the only person rescued. But despite Georgina being rescued before her, Chloe was determined to steal the spotlight. "Hello, boys!" Chloe had been at her flirtatious best, all smiles and suggestive gestures. She had noticed Georgina but pretended not to, and worked her hardest to ensure that many of the Navy crew ignored Georgina too. John had just sat there, looking stunned and saying nothing as Colin was surrounded by medics desperate to save what was left of him. John, Colin, they were both so useless. Neither was fit for sharing the stage with Chloe. It was a shame that Georgina had survived, but she was just a bit part at best. With the story Chloe was going to tell, she would be the only star. When Matthew entered the ward again, he saw Georgina hunched over a pad, frantically scribbling something down. He thought how naturally lovely she looked. He had no time for tryhards, or those who were too assured of their own sexiness. He'd pick a naturally pretty, and even more importantly, intelligent woman, such as Georgina, any day of the week. Georgina was so focused on writing that she did not immediately notice Matthew when he entered. He had to cough twice before she looked up, noticed him, and smiled. "Hey, Matthew, it's good to see you again," Georgina said. "Ditto, please call me Matt," Matt replied. "Okay, so, Matt, I notice you're not wearing your uniform. Is this a social call?" "About that, I've just finished my 4 years active duty. You were my last." Matt searched for the right words to say. "Damsel in distress? No, too corny." Thankfully, Georgina came to his rescue. "Saving the best till last, huh?" she said. "Huh? Guess I needn't worry about being too corny," Matthew thought. He smiled and hoped he wasn't blushing. He felt awkward with women and had a track record of blushing when he was attracted to somebody. He was blushing a little, but Georgina pretended not to notice. It was refreshing for her to not be the more awkward person in the room. "Yeah, something like that," Matt managed. "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner tonight, with me, together." Georgina smiled a little wider. "You mean a date?" she asked. "Well, yeah, I hope so. That is, if you'll—" "I'd love to," Georgina answered, letting him off the hook. "So where are you?" Before she could find out where he was planning on taking her, they were interrupted by another naval officer entering the room. Georgina had been given a brief respite from the agonizing drama of the Kangaroo Airways crash. And here was somebody to drag her back down to earth again. It was Matt's friend and former partner in the Navy, Sarah. "Hey, Georgina, Matt, sorry to interrupt. There's somebody here to see Georgina. He's from the British Embassy," Sarah said. "Can Matt come with me too?" Georgina asked hopefully. Sarah looked from Georgina to Matt and smiled. It was like a light switch had gone on, and she had twigged that there was something between the two of them. Something new and exciting for the two of them. "Sure, if he wants to," Sarah replied. "Yes, I'll keep you company," Matt agreed. He then whispered to Georgina, "But this doesn't count as our date." The British ambassador was an old, incredibly thin-looking man with a face that reminded Georgina of a weasel. Despite the heat, he was wearing a black suit and a tie. "Mrs. Potter, a pleasure to meet you," he began, extending a wrinkly hand towards Georgina. She shook it gently as he continued, feeling afraid that the ambassador might break if she were to shake it too hard. "I'm Mr. Brooke, from the British Embassy. My dear, what you've been through, well, I can't even begin to imagine." "Thanks," Georgina replied. Mr. Brooke turned to Matt next and smiled. And you are? Mr. Brooke asked. Matt Slane. I was with the US Navy, Matt said. Mr. Brooke looked confused as to why Matt was here, and his smile began to slip. He rescued me, Georgina added helpfully. The smile returned to Mr. Brooke's face and he shook Matt's hand too. Well, in that case, it is a pleasure to meet you too, Mr. Slane. Thank you for your service, he said. I am afraid, though, that you have now caught me somewhat unprepared, as I have only brought one ticket. I'm sorry? A ticket to what? Georgina asked. Why, a plane ticket back to England, of course, Mr. Brooke replied, beaming at Georgina. Georgina looked horrified. Matt was worried that she was about to faint and placed his hand on Georgina's shoulder to support her. No, Georgina protested. No, I can't. I'm not ready to get on another plane. I may never be ready to get on another plane. Even if I was, I can't go now. Oh, my dear, how insensitive of me, Mr. Brooke said, chiding himself. Should I arrange for you to travel by boat instead? You just leave it with me, and No, that's not it. Well, not all of it. Have you seen the news? Nobody has told the true story about what really happened aboard Kangaroo Airways Flight 377, Georgina replied angrily. She was in danger of becoming hysterical. And what would that truth be? Mr. Brooke asked. That they left us to die. When the plane crashed, the flight crew just abandoned us. All of us. They can't be allowed to get away with it, Georgina cried. If she had felt more composed, she may have listed each of the many violations that she witnessed the staff of Kangaroo Airways committing. They had flown with only one air stewardess, and that air stewardess was possibly mentally unstable. They hadn't had enough life vests aboard. They had flown through a dangerous airspace, and the passengers had paid the price for this decision. They had trapped a passenger, Georgina herself, inside a lavatory with a dead body, for Christ's sake. Somebody had to make them pay. Mr. Brooke hadn't been expecting this. My dear, those are very serious accusations, and this is a very delicate situation. Yes, most delicate, he replied. Huh? Asked Matt. What do you mean by delicate? Australia is our close ally, and as for China and Taiwan, Britain is keen to remain neutral and wait and see how this whole nasty business between the two nations pans out. The story of Kangaroo Airways has become intertwined with the fate of China and Taiwan. China is saying that the plane being shot down was Taiwan's fault, whereas Taiwan is claiming that it wasn't shot down at all and that the Chinese pilots simply collided with the passenger plane. Your story of insanity, incompetence, and an evil airline, well, it's just too complicated. It would just muddy the water, and my dear, I am afraid that the narrative is no longer yours to write. That falls to China and Taiwan now, Mr. Brooke replied. Georgina felt so angry. Matt was worried that she might actually hit the British ambassador. It wasn't like he didn't have it coming, but he was so old and frail that Matt was worried that one hit might be enough to finish him off. Matt squeezed Georgina's hand, hoping to comfort her and also to calm her down. Hey, he said quietly. That's, Georgina roared. She let go of Matt's hand. Taking the plane ticket from Mr. Brooke's hand, she threw it into the dustbin, which stood in the corner of the room. Georgina stomped out of the meeting room and slammed the door behind her. Mr. Brooke was shaking. Oh my, he said, feeling flustered. Well, I never. Matt picked the plane ticket out of the dustbin and placed it carefully in his trouser pocket. He patted Mr. Brooke on his back lightly. Hey, bud, please, leave Georgina to me, okay? I'll try to convince her to drop this, Matt said to Mr. Brooke. Mr. Brooke coughed and composed himself. Yes, well, in that case, my good man, I wish you good luck. I do hope that you can talk more sense into that woman than I was able to. Having said this, Mr. Brooke shook Matt Slane's hand, and then he slowly left the room too. Matt felt torn. It wasn't that he didn't believe Georgina's version of events. If he was being honest, then at this stage he wasn't entirely sure what to believe at all. If Georgina was telling the truth, though, then she was up against governments who didn't want her to tell the truth, or at least weren't prepared to hear it, and a rich and morally bankrupt airline company who would most likely be prepared to do anything to conceal the truth. And then there was Chloe Markham, the air stewardess. From what Matt had heard about Chloe from Georgina over the past few days, Chloe was crazy and dangerous, possibly even a psychopath. Who knows what somebody as cruel as Chloe would be prepared to do to conceal the truth? What lengths would she go to in order to silence Georgina if she decided that Georgina had become too large an irritation? She may even try to kill Georgina. Matt didn't think this was far-fetched. After all, if Georgina had told him the truth, then Chloe had already attempted to kill Georgina once by locking her inside a lavatory shortly before the plane crashed. On the other hand, it clearly meant a lot to Georgina that the truth got out there and that Kangaroo Airways, or at the very least Chloe, were at least partly held responsible for the deaths of 51 passengers who had been abandoned aboard a sinking plane. It was all too damn dangerous. Matt had only just started to have a relationship with Georgina. Hell, it might even be too soon to call it a relationship. After all, they hadn't even been on their first official date yet. He didn't want to lose her now. Matt took the plane ticket from his pocket, stared at it, and patted it against his hand. To Georgina, the plane ticket was something to be feared. To Matt, it represented hope and a chance for a fresh start. He imagined a cosy, peaceful life with Georgina living in England. True, it was early to be having thoughts like this, but Matt couldn't help it. There was just something special about Georgina. If there was going to be any chance of them having a happy life together, though, then Matt knew that first he would need to protect Georgina, protect her from the money men at Kangaroo Airways, protect her from herself, from that stubborn streak which could get her into a world of trouble. And perhaps most of all, he had to protect Georgina from Chloe.